If you have ADHD and find yourself spiraling into negative thoughts, even when nothing's actually wrong, this video is for you. And I want to start by saying something important. This isn't because you're pessimistic or weak-minded, and it's not because you just need a better mindset. What you're experiencing may be neurological, and once you understand what's actually happening in the ADHD brain, these patterns make a lot more sense, and more importantly, they become easier to work with instead of fighting against. On this channel, my aim is to educate and empower using evidence-based medicine and a root cause lens, looking beyond medication alone to understand what's really driving ADHD symptoms. Most people think ADHD is a focus disorder, but clinically, ADHD is just as much an emotional regulation disorder and often a nervous system disorder as it is an attention issue. People with ADHD tend to have higher emotional reactivity, stronger stress responses, more sensitivity to perceived rejection or criticism, and a harder time disengaging from internal experiences. That last part is key, because when an ADHD brain locks onto a negative thought, it doesn't just think the thought, it experiences it. That's why negative thoughts in ADHD often feel loud, sticky, convincing, and emotionally intense. This isn't imagination, this is brain wiring. Let's talk about what's actually going on in the brain. In ADHD, executive function is already less efficient. Executive function includes emotional regulation, perspective taking, impulse control, and the ability to shift attention. When executive function is low, the brain has a harder time stepping back and saying, this is just a thought, or this might not be true, or this will pass. Now layer stress on top of that. When stress hormones like cortisol rise, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for logic, reasoning, and regulation, becomes less active. At the same time, more primitive brain regions involved in threat detection become more dominant. This creates the perfect storm. The brain becomes more reactive, more negative, more self-critical, and more focused on perceived danger or failure. So instead of having a balanced internal dialogue, the ADHD brain under stress starts telling a very specific story. I'm messing everything up, I always fail, something is wrong with me, or I just can't get it together. And because the prefrontal cortex is underpowered in that moment, those thoughts don't get challenged. They feel like facts. Another layer here is something called rejection sensitivity, which is extremely common in ADHD. Rejection sensitivity doesn't mean you're fragile, it means your nervous system reacts strongly to perceived criticism, disapproval, or failure, even when it's subtle or imagined. This can show up as ruminating on conversations, replaying mistakes, assuming others are upset with you, or interpreting neutral feedback as personal failure. When rejection sensitivity combines with low executive function and high stress, negative thoughts multiply very quickly. One small trigger can spiral into shame, anxiety, self-judgment, and emotional shutdown or overwhelm. And once that spiral starts, it can feel almost impossible to stop. This is where a lot of advice completely misses the mark. You'll hear things like change your thoughts, reframe the situation, practice positive affirmations, or don't believe everything you think. And while those ideas aren't wrong in theory, they often fail in ADHD when the brain isn't regulated enough to use them. This is the part that matters most. If dopamine is low, if stress hormones are high, if the nervous system is dysregulated, if inflammation is present, your brain simply does not have the capacity to think flexibly. You can't access perspective when the brain is in survival mode. So telling someone with ADHD in that state to just think differently is like asking someone with a broken ankle to run harder. The problem isn't effort, it's physiology. This is why I always talk about a brain-first approach. Before we try to change thoughts, we have to ask, is the nervous system regulated? Is blood sugar stable? Is dopamine supported? Is sleep adequate? Is inflammation present? Because when the brain is calmer and better supported, thoughts naturally become less extreme. Not because you force them to change, but because the brain is no longer in threat mode. This is why many people with ADHD notice I'm way more negative when I'm exhausted, my thoughts spiral when I'm overwhelmed, I think clearly after I rest or decompress. That's not coincidence, that's nervous system physiology. One of the hardest parts of negative thinking in ADHD is how real it feels. In those moments, your brain isn't saying, this is a thought, it's saying, this is the truth. That's because stress and emotional reactivity amplify certainty. The brain becomes less flexible and more rigid in its interpretations. This is why negative thoughts in ADHD often feel absolute. Thoughts like always, never, everyone, or no one. These are hallmarks of a brain under stress. Now, I want to give you one practical tool that can help in the moment. Not because it magically fixes everything, but because it works with the ADHD brain. When a negative thought starts looping, write it down. Not to analyze it, not to correct it, not to turn it positive, just write it down. Here's why this works. First, it externalizes the thought. Instead of it bouncing endlessly around your mind, it becomes something outside of you, something that you can look at. That alone reduces intensity. Second, writing engages the prefrontal cortex. It slows the process down and shifts your brain out of pure survival mode. You're no longer just reacting, you're observing. This creates a small but powerful gap between I am this thought and I'm having this thought. And for ADHD brains, that gap is everything. You don't have to believe every thought your brain throws at you, but with ADHD, you do have to learn how to observe thoughts without immediately engaging with them. That doesn't mean suppressing them, it doesn't mean arguing with them, it doesn't mean forcing positivity, but it means noticing them without letting them take over. And for many people with ADHD, this skill only becomes accessible once the nervous system is more regulated. Which brings us back to the core message. Negative thought spirals in ADHD are not a moral issue. They're not a discipline issue. They're not a motivation issue. They are a brain state issue. And when you address the brain state through regulation, support, and capacity building, thinking patterns shift naturally. Not perfectly, not overnight, but sustainably. So to recap, negative thoughts in ADHD are louder because emotional reactivity is higher, executive regulation is lower, stress hormones amplify threat perception, and rejection sensitivity increases self-criticism. You can't think your way out of a dysregulated brain, which is why a brain-first approach matters. And simple tools like writing thoughts down can help interrupt the spiral by re-engaging the prefrontal cortex and creating some distance. If you struggle with negative thoughts in ADHD, your brain is doing exactly what it was wired to do under stress. The goal isn't to silence your thoughts, it's to support your brain so those thoughts start to lose their grip. If you found value in this video, consider subscribing for more evidence-based ADHD content like this.